David's been on before. He is a political philosophy professor at the University of Navarra in Spain. David, tell us what on earth happened with Twitter?
Well, it came as a bit of a surprise to me when I woke up one morning to be told that I had been suspended, my account had been suspended in Twitter. And I appealed that decision, and within a couple of days, I was told that the suspension was permanent due to what they called repeat violations. And so I trawled back over my Twitter account to see, okay, what tweets had fallen foul of my Twitter censors over the past 6 months or so. And my account had been suspended or frozen or locked at least 4 times in total, including the last time. And basically, every time I touched on the topic of vaccines or on the topic of ivermectin, there was an intervention.
Yeah.
So essentially, I said things that I considered to be relatively conservative. I basically reported on my interpretation of peer-reviewed data and expert testimony, sworn testimony of physicians before the US Senate. And I basically drew my own conclusions from that public evidence.
So what do you think is really going on here with Twitter regarding you and your account?
Well, basically, I don't think it's only in relation to my account. I think that Twitter has basically interpreted its own arbitration role as a kind of, in a very ideologically and politically slanted way. Essentially, it's used its role as a kind of arbitrator of public discourse in order to advance its own political agenda and its own scientific opinions.
Yeah.
And I think this is a confusion of its proper role, because Twitter now controls an important chunk of the public sphere, just as YouTube does.
Yes.
And they have a responsibility to permit free, moral, political, and scientific discussion.
Right.
And what they're doing instead of that is they're adopting a partisan stance on a range of contested political, moral, and scientific questions.
Yes.
So, for example, on the ivermectin matter, so far we haven't said anything that could possibly be censored, as far as I could tell, even if it was on YouTube. But on the ivermectin question, there is disagreement in the scientific community on that question, and I have no problem with acknowledging that there is that disagreement, and that experts and there are some articles that are coming out of both sides. But one has to make an interpretation of the data and of the articles. I'm not a medical expert, so I draw on the testimony and publications of medical experts. And just as other people can freely draw conclusions against ivermectin, one should be free to draw conclusions in favor of it as well in an open discussion.
Yes.
But this is very, very worrying, this tendency of the big tech companies to basically intervene in legitimate disagreements, legitimate scientific disagreements and debates, because they simply don't have the scientific expertise or the authority to do that, or the moral authority to do that. Even if they're a private company, they have a public responsibility. They have a responsibility to basically manage the public sphere in a way that permits the free flow of ideas.
Yes.
That's how I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. And I'm just looking at the article, well, you've written several articles about this situation now. And you're absolutely right. You say Twitter now services a large chunk of the infrastructure of public debate and discourse, one of the backbones of a vibrant democracy. Absolutely. What makes Twitter's public function even more impressive is the fact that it, along with YouTube and Facebook, effectively exerts an unrivaled oligopoly. Is that oligopoly? That's a new word to me. Over the digital public sphere. And that is the reality, isn't it? Is that we are talking about immense power to direct public debate. And that is troubling, isn't it?
It is, because the traditional idea of censorship before we had kind of internet and social media was that we expected censorship to come from the state, because the state effectively had its effective monopoly over a lot of television stations and so on. And then when internet came along, and when we had these social media giants that came along, and when I say oligopoly, I just mean a monopoly that is essentially exercised by more than one actor. So it's a handful of actors who control a very large section of the public sphere. And so traditionally we would have thought that private companies could not really exercise censorship, because we assumed that if there's a lot of private companies, the consumer and the citizen has a choice and can, if they don't like what YouTube's doing, they just go to another platform. But as I'm discovering, as I try to seek alternative platforms and for my views, it's not quite as simple as that, because if you go to Rumble from YouTube, you automatically lose a massive audience.
You built up 25,000 followers on Twitter, and that was through sheer hard work. I know what it takes to build up a Twitter following. You can't just sit there and put out a tweet every now and again. No. You have to create content, and you have to keep going, and you did, you know, thoroughly. And I do think that you make, well, you as I say, you've written several articles, and you make a lot of valid points, as I knew you would. I mean, I rate you very much, David, as a thinker. And one of the things that you say is about some general considerations on Twitter's censorship policies, which you alluded to back there. And that is, they are essentially saying this side is right and this side is wrong. And as you say, the essence of modern science is debate. It is the exchange of conflicting arguments, and we're not being allowed that at all.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because in the end of the day, if we're going to uncover the truth, if we're going to understand reality, if we're going to understand, for example, how COVID is transmitted, how it can be treated, just exactly how effective the vaccines are, what are the risks for different populations for taking the vaccine, how well tested is the vaccine, all of these really important questions. It's actually impossible to get to the bottom of those questions if there is a censor breathing down your neck, shutting down debate, saying this side is right, this side is wrong. Because essentially what they're doing is they're saying, before they've heard all the evidence, they're saying we are going to decide that one side is right and one side is wrong. And one argument that Twitter gives, that you'll often hear them give this argument, is they'll say, oh, we rely on the expert authorities to tell us what's right and wrong and what's information and disinformation. And so that's a completely fallacious argument, it's completely flawed, because the fact that somebody ends up on the WHO committee of experts does not mean that their view is necessarily better than the view of someone who works at, say, a university. It's like this hierarchy of knowledge where people assume that just because you had the good luck to get onto the WHO board of experts, therefore you're infallible. Therefore, your view is better than the view of, say, an expert at Harvard or Stanford or Oxford.
Right.
That's a completely illogical position to take.
Yeah. David, the problem that we're experiencing, of course, is there is a speeding up of online censorship taking place. And one of the things, of course, is the online harms bill that they are very keen to push through. And they are even willing to use the murder of a politician to do it. The murder of Sir David Amess had absolutely nothing to do with online, absolutely nothing to do whatsoever. And yet one politician, well, not just one politician, but one politician in particular, stood up in the House of Parliament and made this claim that we need to now properly tackle, you know, trolls on online media. Everybody, nobody can be anonymous anymore. Now, I know from many years of activism that sometimes people have to be anonymous, otherwise they wouldn't be able to join in with activism whatsoever. What are your thoughts about the online harms bill and what direction we're heading?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the details of the online harms bill, to be honest. I haven't studied it closely, but I will say this much, and that is that there's a saying that says hard cases make bad law. So if you basically focus on one sensational case and then build a law around that one case, then you end up making these very general laws that confer very general powers on censors, for example. And those censors are not only going to use those powers in very narrowly described cases, in very, very narrow specific cases. They're going to use those laws with all the discretion that they're given. And so, so censorship is a notoriously slippery sort of idea, especially the idea of harm and misinformation. So what is harmful and, say, deceptive information or misleading information? What is it exactly, right? Um, it's something that, in the end of the day, can be defined by the person who's censoring you, and it's very difficult to to limit how they define misinformation, how they define harm. And so a perfect example is what just happened to me on Twitter, a view that they happened to disagree with, but that is held by respected scientists and that you could see peer-reviewed evidence for in the literature. Because they disagree with it, they define it as misleading information or harmful information.
Outrageous.
Yeah, so I would be very leery of any attempt to introduce, say, severe restrictions on public discourse in the name of protecting us from harm.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not completely against all forms of censorship. Let me just qualify that.
Understood.
For example, certain kinds of violence, graphic violence, maybe, or child abuse should not be put on the internet. Certain kinds of pornography should not be on daytime TV, and or maybe not on TV in general, right? But my point is just that we should be very conservative about giving censorship powers to anyone, because the censors are human beings who have political agendas and have interests. So I think what we should get away from is this notion that the person we give the powers to is going to be a saint and is going to perfectly exercise those powers in the public interest. Human beings are not saints. There's a lot of self-interest mixed in with politics.
The fact is, who is checking the fact checkers? Who's censoring the censors? And it's like, it is very arbitrary at times and very concerning. Scott, who does a news review with us, was also booted off Twitter this weekend for something absolutely ridiculous. And that's even more problematic for him. He's actually really poorly. And he converses with people about his condition in his messages and he can't access them. And it's like, and this is the thing, I think people have to start realizing we need to start pulling back from big tech, because it's not going to get better, is it?
I'm afraid that I don't think it's going to get better. I mean, normally the idea of a free market is that when one player acts badly or doesn't provide a good service, you can then just switch to another actor, another player, another service.
Yes.
And in this case, the problem is going back to what I call the oligopoly. They're monopolizing. They've managed to develop an effective oligopoly or joint monopoly over the public square. What I mean by that is that it's very hard to find viable alternatives in which you can reach a large audience. So like Twitter, there's Gab, for example. Okay, well, in practice, Gab, there are not that many people. I mean, there's a limited audience you can reach in Gab, very limited.
That's the problem. It becomes an echo chamber with some of these platforms.
It becomes an echo, exactly. And I think that Twitter's irresponsible behavior, what it's led to is it's led to an exacerbation of the echo chamber problem, because people are actually going to leave Twitter and join smaller platforms that are more self-selected, in which you have a narrower audience who have more agreement on certain fundamentals. So in the end of the day, you're narrowing the debate, and the knock-on effect of their censorship is to create other platforms that are also narrower. So what's the answer to this? I mean, I guess for now, my strategy is to keep open my conventional mainstream accounts like YouTube, keep using them, maybe not put stuff that's very sensitive on them, so to avoid censorship.
You have to be careful. But, come to brand new Tube, David. Careful.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, so what I do is then I use parallel channels to support emerging social media channels, and that way I have two tracks going on. And I would love to say that one day in the not too distant future, I can just jump ship on YouTube and just say, I'll leave them behind.
I know.
And I don't need them anymore. But for now, I would be shooting myself in the foot if I shut down my YouTube account.
And absolutely understood. I mean, I've never known a time where we have been so undemocratic. I mean, last week, for example, they ruled on an extension of the Coronavirus Act, which is so anti-democratic, it's unreal. But they ruled on a 6-month extension on it on no vote. Labour didn't oppose it, and Tories just put it straight through. I mean, that is so obscene, and it's totalitarian, and it deeply concerns me the direction we're going in. I mean, we are transparently being shown what appears to be corruption, and it is more transparent than it's ever been, and it's almost like saying you can't do anything about this. And I mean, what's your feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is in part that there are two senses of corruption. You know, corruption could mean, say, just completely disregarding all procedures and just saying, you know, my will is the law, or say taking bribes and so on. But there's a more subtle form of corruption, which basically uses procedures such as emergency legislation procedures,
Right,
and then abuses them to perpetuate a state of emergency, even when we're not really facing a real emergency. In that sense, I think the wool has been pulled over a lot of people's eyes, because if the corruption is not too drastic, or let's say if it's dressed up under certain procedures and so on, then people are more willing to accept it, right? If it was an armed coup, people would say, oh my God, we're at war. There's a civil war, or somebody has overthrown the regime. But what about overthrowing a regime by basically completely disregarding its underlying spirit of freedom and constitutionalism? There are ways of dismantling a regime from the inside.
Absolutely.
And my belief is that people who are ramming through emergency legislation, both in Ireland and the United Kingdom and in other countries, are basically dismantling their regimes of constitutional democracy piece by piece. And because it's a somewhat gradual process, because there are a lot of freedoms that are still intact, and because they're still using certain procedures, people are willing to buy it. A lot of people are still willing to buy it. So, I mean, I think we have to wake people up so that they can realize what's going on, and realize that their freedoms, their basic liberties are in jeopardy. And I mean, just think of the people who are unvaccinated for lots of legitimate reasons, including in many cases the fact that they've had COVID already and therefore have natural immunity. And these people are being just kicked out of their jobs.
Oh, it's horrendous. I mean, horrendous, absolutely horrendous.
At the very top of my website, I have all the channels through which people can engage with me. And that website is my name, davidthunder.com. So it's very simple, davidthunder.com, thunder as in thunder and lightning, davidthunder.com. And there's a contact panel on my page. Just go to contact and you have a way of contacting me there. So I'm not on Twitter anymore. I am on Telegram. I have a Facebook page. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Rumble. All of those links are on the top of my page, davidthunder.com. So I welcome people to please, if they can, support me, to go to davidthunder.com and just connect with me and follow me on those platforms.
David, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
There's
an open door to you. You know, I really like where you're coming from. You know, it's a very sort of solid level space that you hold. You're not saying anything outrageous.
No.
That's where I have a real problem with it. And I believe that we need to have more voices like you. So listen, take really good care of yourself, and we will speak to you very soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.